National TV, Pam Bondi tried to tear down Jasmine Crockett with one word: unqualified. But what Crockett said next didn't just shut the room down, it changed the conversation entirely. They were just 10 minutes into the panel when everything shifted. The setting was the American Forum on Judicial Reform, broadcast live from the Lincoln Theater in Washington, D.C. It was packed. Senators, judges, community leaders, law students, even a few celebrities tucked into the front row. You could almost feel the tension in the air. Before anyone said a word on stage sat 5 speakers behind a long, white-draped table. But the spotlight, figuratively and literally, was locked on 2 women at the center. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, polished, practiced, and clearly at home in the political spotlight. And Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, relatively new to the national stage, but with a fire that audiences had quickly grown to expect the moderator trying to steer. The conversation with Grace had just asked a question about the balance between state rights and federal oversight in policing reform. Bondi answered first, her voice smooth and rehearsed. We need real experience to drive this conversation, not performative. Outrage. These issues require legal understanding, not hashtags or headlines. Crockett sat still, barely blinking. She waited when the moderator gestured toward her. That's when Bondi turned directly toward Crockett and said loud enough to echo frankly, "I don't think you're qualified to speak on this there." It was one sentence that set everything off. The room didn't gasp. It froze, the kind of stillness that crackles with anticipation. Crockett's mouth didn't move for 2 seconds. 3. She leaned in toward her microphone, calm, collected. "I'm sorry, what exactly do you think makes me unqualified?" Her tone didn't rise, it dropped low and exacting, like a warning. Bondi hesitated just for a moment. "Well, I've served as a state attorney general. I've prosecuted major cases. I've sat in rooms making decisions that shaped policy. This isn't a space for—" She gestured vaguely with her hand. Emotional responses. Crockett kept looking at her. Then she nodded. "Once. Interesting. I've tried over 100 criminal cases as a public defender. I've argued motions most lawyers wouldn't dare touch. I've written legislation past it, and worked with both parties to move things forward. But if you think experience only counts when it looks like yours, maybe that's the real problem." The crowd reacted, not with applause, but with something heavier, attention focus. Even the moderator didn't interrupt. He knew better. Pam Bondi's expression barely changed. Her right eye twitched, but only slightly. Crockett continued, her voice steady. "See, I didn't come here for sound bites. I came with receipts. I came with the names of mothers who've called me at midnight because no one else would take their call. I came with the words of kids who are afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them." Bondi opened her mouth again, but this time the moderator stepped in. "Let's stay on topic," he said. But it was too late. The match had been lit and Crockett had just started to strike the flame. Someone in the audience whispered loud enough to be caught by the microphones, "She's cooking." Her laughter followed, brief but unmistakable. Crockett turned slightly toward the audience, not smiling but holding their attention like a trial lawyer in closing argument. "The truth is, when some folks feel threatened, they reach for dismissal. Calling someone unqualified without knowing their background isn't just disrespectful, it's dishonest. But I'm not surprised. I've seen this before, and I'll see it again." She paused. Her eyes met Bond's. "But next time you call someone unqualified, you might want to check your facts first." The room didn't erupt, but it shifted. Everyone felt it, and in that moment it was clear the conversation had changed. But to understand just how deep this clash ran, we need to go back before the lights, before the cameras, before anyone even knew this moment was coming. Before Jasmine Crockett ever sat under those studio lights. She was sitting behind a scratched-up desk in a cramped office. In downtown Dallas, it was 2 bothering, and she was a public defender just trying to make a difference in a system that didn't seem to notice women like her, unless they were in handcuffs. The courthouse was loud, fluorescent lit, and smelled like overbrewed coffee. Her heels clicked. Down those echoing halls 5 days a week, sometimes 6, she'd meet with clients in tiny rooms, half of them barely understanding what they'd been charged with, let alone how to fight it. She never raised her voice in court, not because she couldn't, But because silence and precision made more noise, Jasmine didn't just argue. She dissected judges noticed, so did prosecutors. She wasn't supposed to go that far. The system wasn't built for someone like her to bend the rules with knowledge instead of power, but she kept doing it. And people started to talk at the same time Pam Bondi was finishing her second term as Attorney General in Florida. Her name was on TV every other week, always composed, always in control. She stood firm against Obama. She took strong stances on criminal sentencing, and she was widely seen as part of the GOP's elite, sharp-polished connected. Bondi didn't rise through the system, she walked into it, backed by networks, endorsements, and invitations. Her platform had teeth because she had friends with microphones. Crockett, meanwhile, earned her stripes case by case. She didn't have a PR team or cable news. She had stacks of case files and the kind of memory that didn't let small injustices slip away. But Crockett wasn't bitter. She was hungry, and more than that, she believed the law could still work if enough people were willing to fight for it from inside. In 2019, she ran for the Texas House of Representatives. Most people didn't expect her to win. She didn't look like the others. She didn't talk like them either. But her campaign was real, fueled by neighborhood meetings, church basements, and street corners. She didn't promise change. She demanded it, and it worked once elected. She kept pushing criminal justice reform, bail reform, protecting voting rights, standing up. When others sat down, there were moments in committee rooms where people rolled their eyes when she walked in. Those same people stopped rolling their eyes when she started speaking. What made Crockett different wasn't just her fire. It was the way she used it back then. Bondi was mostly on TV, commentating, endorsing, taking part in high-profile panels. She made appearances at CPAC, hosted fundraisers with influential names. She was still in the mix but not in the trenches. And that's what stung the most, because by the time the two women sat side by side on that panel, they didn't just represent opposing parties. They represented opposing philosophies. One believed change came from upholding tradition with firmness. The other believed tradition had to be challenged for real justice to breathe. They had clashed quietly before, during policy debates, online, statements, brief interviews where each mentioned the other's name with carefully measured sarcasm. But this panel, this was the first time they'd sit across from each other, unfiltered, unscripted, and in real time. But tensions like these don't stay quiet for long. Not when truth has been building pressure in the background. It wasn't the first time Jasmine Crockett had heard her name pass through Pam Bondi's mouth, but it was definitely the most direct. Months earlier, Crockett had been on MSNBC discussing disparities in sentencing laws and had made a point calmly, clearly, about the role former prosecutors played in creating the very systems reformers were trying to fix. She hadn't mentioned Bondi directly, didn't need to. The reference was clear. A week later, on a conservative podcast with a modest but loyal following, Bondi responded, "She's loud, she's theatrical. I'm not sure if she wants change or just attention." Bondi had said there's a difference between being in front of a camera and doing the work. Crockett didn't reply. Not in the press, not online, but her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. She knew what Bondi was doing. The slight was subtle enough to fly under most radar, but clear enough to rattle those who were listening. Bondi had no problem using tone to discredit, and when tone didn't work, she'd use credentials. It was part of a bigger pattern, one Crockett had dealt with her whole career. During her first year in Congress, she'd seen it in committee meetings when she asked direct questions some colleagues called her aggressive. When others interrupted, she was told to keep things civil. When she presented statistics and legal precedent, she was accused of grandstanding, and every time she watched less experienced men get praised for the same behavior still. She played the long game. There was one moment, though, one croquet never talked about publicly. It was at a bipartisan dinner in Baltimore. Quiet off camera, meant to build bridges. Bondi was there, so was Crockett, over shrimp cocktail and politely arranged place cards. Bondi made a comment loud enough for nearby ears. "Some folks think passion is a replacement for experience," she said, eyes never leaving her glass of wine. Crockett turned to her, "And some folks think experience means never being challenged. I'm not that kind of Democrat." There wasn't a follow-up, just a tight smile from Bondi and a quick shift to another topic. But everyone at that table remembered it. Their feud wasn't personal. It was ideological. One saw reform as a threat. To order, the other saw reform as the only way to restore order. So when Crockett was invited to speak on the national panel in D.C., she already knew Bondi would be there. Her staff had asked if she wanted to decline, maybe appear on another night. Crockett didn't blink. No, she said. I want to sit right next to her in the days leading up to the event. The media teased the possibility of a heated exchange. Commentators speculated whether Crockett would hold her, or whether Bondi would pull rank. But Crockett wasn't preparing for a debate. She was preparing for a reckoning. She spent hours reviewing old clips of Bondi's interviews, pulling court documents, watching press conferences from the early 2000s. And she didn't want dirt. She wanted facts. If Bondi tried to discredit her, she was going to respond not with rage, but with record. She even practiced responses with her team, kept them short, sharp, and clear. The goal wasn't to go viral. The goal was to make it undeniable, because Crockett knew what was coming. She could feel it, but no amount of preparation could replace the electricity of the moment itself. And when the lights came on, everything she'd held back was about to rise. It started with a single pause, sharp, intentional, after Pam Bondi dismissed her with the word unqualified. Jasmine Crockett didn't jump in. She let the silence carry weight, let the audience sit with the arrogance of it. Then she leaned forward. Pam, she said, not bothering with formal titles. You know what's funny? You keep saying this conversation is for the experienced. But let's actually talk about experience, real experience. Her voice was steady, not angry, but her eyes didn't leave Bondi's. You were Florida's AG from 2011 to 2019, right? That means you were in charge when your office opposed the early release of non-violent offenders, some of whom were black men serving excessive sentences for marijuana. Bondi raised her hand slightly as if to cut her off. Crockett continued, and during your tenure, the state of Florida blocked more than 60% of clemency applications. You sat on a system that buried people for mistakes they were never allowed to grow out of. A murmur spread through the room. Meanwhile, I was in court. Crockett said, every day standing next to those same people. Your policies crushed, fighting to keep a 17-year-old from spending the rest of his life behind bars for having 2 grams of weed in his pocket. Bondi's voice cracked in, louder, now defensive. Your oversimplifying policy requires structure. It's not as black and white as you're making it. Crockett turned slightly, not toward her, but toward the crowd. That's the problem. It shouldn't be this complicated to treat people with dignity. But when you build a career out of gatekeeping justice, I guess it makes sense. The moderator's face was tense now. He looked like he wanted to intervene but couldn't find the right moment. Bondi leaned back, but her mouth curled into a faint smirk. You think you're the only one who's been in the courtroom? No, Crockett said quickly. But I think I'm one of the few up here who's actually stood next to someone who was afraid to lose everything. Not as a prosecutor pushing for time, but as the only hope they had. Left that one hit, the panel grew still. Crockett adjusted the mic. Her hands relaxed. I'm not unqualified. I'm inconvenient because I don't say what people want to hear. I say what's been happening. Someone in the back whispered. Say that again. But Crockett didn't need to. The moment had already landed. Bondi glanced at the moderator. Are we really turning this into a personal attack? This is personal. Crockett shot back to every family that's been split by a system you called structured, to every teenager who learned that a plea deal was their only way out, even if they were innocent. Then she exhaled, soft but audible. You want to talk qualifications? Let's talk about the bills I helped write that reduced jail populations in my state. The bipartisan coalitions I helped form, the courtroom fights I took on without cameras, without applause. That's experience too. You just don't want to see it because it doesn't look like yours. A slow clap began in the back. Someone stood up, then another. The moderator tried to regain order. Let's allow each guest to respond without interruption. Crockett nodded and sat back in her chair, not smug, composed. Pam Bondi looked rattled for the first time. She flipped through her notes, said nothing. The cameras kept rolling, but it was already done. The energy had shifted completely. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were with her. But Crockett hadn't even touched the receipts she came armed with. And what came next would turn a confrontation into something far bigger. Jasmine Crockett didn't believe in dragging people for sport, but she did believe in accountability, and that meant calling things out by name. So when the moderator asked if any panelists had concrete examples to share, Crockett didn't hesitate. Sure, she said, let's talk about track records since that's apparently the measure here. Pam Bondi sat still, her hand resting on the table, thumb lightly tapping against her folder. Crockett pulled out a slim manila envelope. No dramatics. Just precision in 2014 she began. Your office filed a brief arguing against same-sex marriage in Florida, saying it would cause significant harm to society. Bondi shifted in 2015. Your office failed to prosecute a single police officer in the state for wrongful death. Despite 3 high-profile cases involving unarmed black men, Bondi tried to interrupt. There were legal thresholds that I'm sure there were, Crockett said, cutting in softly. But the public saw what they saw, and they remembered who stood silent. The moderator looked visibly uncomfortable, but Crocker wasn't speaking to him. She addressed the crowd now in 2016. Bondi's campaign accepted a $25,000 donation from a Trump charity, right before her office decided not to join the lawsuit against Trump University. Not whispers, gasps. Crockett's voice remained calm, controlled, like she'd rehearsed this 100 times because she had. I'm not saying Pam Bondi isn't smart, she said, looking directly at her. But when you talk about qualifications and you overlook your own missteps while dismissing mine, you're not defending justice, you're defending hierarchy. Bondi tried to smile. I won elections. I led a state. Crockett didn't flinch. So did I. And I didn't need a national platform or big donors to do it, just the people. Then she paused. Let the moment breathe. And by the way, she added, reaching for her phone on the table, before you call anyone performative, maybe don't appear on national television trying to undermine prison reform with stats you cherry-picked. She held the screen up for a second, an article with Bondi's face and the headline, Former Florida AG Misrepresents Crime Statistics in Fox Interview. Bondi's eyes flashed, her smile vanished. The moderator cleared his throat. Let's remember, this is a dialogue, not a courtroom. Crockett didn't turn toward him. Her attention stayed, locked on Bondi. I'm not trying to win an argument, she said. I'm trying to remind people that credentials don't mean credibility. If they're used to prop up broken systems. Silence stretched across the panel. One of the other guests, a retired federal judge from Arizona, spoke next. She's right, he said, glancing around. We've all seen how policy gets used as a weapon when people in power don't want to listen. I may not agree with every stance Congresswoman Crockett takes, but I respect the work. It's real. It wasn't the judge's agreement that made the moment stick. It was that someone from Bondi's world had acknowledged the truth. Crocker looked down at her papers, reorganized them neatly, then looked back at the audience. I don't need to prove anything to anyone on this stage, she said. But I do owe the truth to everyone watching, because people deserve to know that experience isn't just about titles. It's about time served in the fight, not just time spent watching it. A few heads nodded. Others looked stunned. Pam Bondi said nothing she couldn't. The table, once so comfortably hers, suddenly felt very cold. But Crockett knew this moment wasn't just about a personal takedown, because when the cameras cut, the reaction outside the theater would take on a life of its own. The moment the panel ended, the room didn't exhale. It buzzed, not with applause, not yet, just movement, quiet conversations, darting glances. A few people already texting, others fumbling to open their Twitter apps before they'd even left their seats. Jasmine Crockett didn't stand right away. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, like someone cleaning up after court, calm but never casual. Her face said she was focused. Her body language said she wasn't finished. Pam Bondi rose quickly, a stiff smile frozen on her lips as she exchanged shallow handshakes with the other panelists. She didn't look at Crockett again. Outside the auditorium, a crowd had already gathered near the press barricades, reporters with mics, podcasters streaming live from their phones, and college students, dozens of them, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had just flipped a whole room upside down, Congresswoman Crockett. Do you think Bondi owes you an apology? Were you expecting her to go that far? Did you plan that Crockett didn't dodge them, but she didn't feed them either? I said what needed to be said. She replied, and I didn't say it for headlines. I said it for the people who are sick of watching power protect itself. That clip was on Instagram. Within 5 minutes on TikTok, it hit 500,000 views by midnight on Twitter. Sorry, X. It was trending in 2 hours under hashtags like #Crockett clapback #hard. She brought receipts and #qualified and ready. Even CNN aired the segment. Again twice, but the conversation didn't stay in D.C. It spread to classrooms, group chats, morning shows, church circles, political panels. Everyone had an opinion. Some conservatives called her disrespectful. Others quietly admitted Bondi hadn't handled it well. A few right-leaning pundits tried to spin it into a young leftist anger narrative, but the footage didn't match the frame. Crockett had been calm. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't mocked. She'd laid facts on the table and waited for the room to catch up. That's what made it powerful. And for the people watching, especially young women, especially black women, something about it hit deeper. A 19-year-old from Topeka made a video crying while reacting to the clip. She didn't let them write her off. She said she didn't fold. That's exactly what I needed to see. A teacher in Columbus printed Crockett's quotes and taped them to her classroom wall. Even a retired judge in Santa Rosa who didn't align with Crockett politically wrote a blog post praising her discipline. She made the case, stuck to the facts, and reminded people that poise under pressure matters. And through it all, Crockett kept quiet. No press tour, no victory lap. She returned to Texas, got back to work, and let the moment breathe. Her team received over 3,000 emails in 2 days, many from people who said they'd never watched a panel before, but stayed glued to the screen because of her. They weren't drawn by spectacle. They were drawn by the fact that someone didn't flinch. Bondi, meanwhile, avoided interviews for a week. When she finally addressed the exchange, it was through a written statement, controlled, clipped, and vague. I respect all voices in this debate, even those I disagree with. My focus remains on productive solutions. That was it. No mention of the word unqualified. No acknowledgement of the facts Crockett laid bare. But by then it didn't matter. But for Crockett, this was never about the headlines. It was about something deeper. And she was finally ready to speak on it in her own words. 3 days after the panel, Jasmine Crockett stood behind a wooden podium in a community center in Fort Worth. No cameras this time, just folding chairs, a packed room, and the smell of strong coffee and too many coats in close quarters. The people here weren't pundits or political strategists. They were teachers, barbers, retired nurses, students, some dressed in Sunday best, others in hoodies and boots. What they all shared was that, look, the one that said, "We saw what you did." Crockett didn't open with a thank you. She opened with a question. Anybody in here ever been underestimated? Hands went up immediately. A few chuckles followed. She smiled, but only slightly. I have too, and it doesn't stop just because you win an election or wear a mic. They'll still question how you got there. They'll still try to erase the miles you walked to earn that seat. A woman in the second row shouted, "Say that." But Crockett didn't raise her voice. She leaned in instead, letting her words carry their own weight. When Pam Bondi said I wasn't qualified, she continued, she wasn't just talking to me, she was talking to every young person with big ideas, but no legacy name. Every public defender who gave up a paycheck to fight cases no one else would touch. Every single one of us who got used to proving ourselves twice as hard for half the credit. The room was dead silent now, not from shock, but from recognition. I don't need to be everybody's favorite, she said, but I'm going to be honest. I'm going to ask uncomfortable questions in rooms that were built to ignore them. And if that makes me inconvenient, so be it. There were nods. There were murmurs of agreement. Some folks didn't say a word, but their eyes told her everything. And then she got personal. When I was in college, she said I had a professor who told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously in law. He said I should consider public relations instead. Some gasps, some groans. She gave it a beat. I thanked him, she added, and then I made the dean's list 4 semesters straight. A burst of applause, this time with laughter. The kind that builds a bridge. She kept going, pulling the moment into something more grounded. I'm not here to drag anyone, but I am here to make sure the rooms we walk into don't stay one-sided. Because when we let people like Pam Bondi define who's qualified to speak, we shut the door on a whole generation of leaders. A woman in the back stood and asked, "What do you tell young girls when they're told to stay in their place?" Crockett's answer came without hesitation. "I tell them build your own place and speak so clearly that they can't pretend not to hear you." Someone started clapping again, and this time, it didn't stop. The whole room joined, and she let it wash over her for a moment. Then she raised her hand and the room quieted. This wasn't about winning a debate. She said it was about reminding people what credibility really looks like. It looks like listening. It looks like showing your work. And it looks like never forgetting who you fight for. Even when the lights are off that night, the clip from her Fort Worth speech would make the rounds again, shared, mostly by people who weren't into politics, people who felt like they'd finally seen someone say what they'd been carrying for years. But before she could process the ripple of impact, Crockett took a moment for herself to look back and to think forward. It was the next morning, and Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, sipping lukewarm coffee out of a chipped mug that said, "Defend, don't pretend." Her phone was on silent, though the screen kept lighting up every few seconds with texts, missed calls, and notifications. She wasn't ignoring them. She was just quiet. Not every battle left you needing a microphone, some left you needing a moment. She sat back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling. Exhaling slowly, on the wall across from her desk hung 3 framed items: her law degree, her swearing-in photo from Congress, and a handwritten letter from a former client, a 19-year-old she'd helped beat a felony gun charge 3 years ago. That letter meant more than the other 2 combined in it. The young man had written, "You believed in me when I couldn't explain. What happened when nobody else wanted to hear it? You listened like it mattered. That saved me." Crockett stared at that sentence for a long time. It reminded her of why she never tried to sound like anyone else, why she didn't worry about fitting in with the political elite. She knew that every time she walked into a debate, a panel, or a committee meeting, she brought with her the voices of people who never got a seat at the table. Her mind drifted to that night again. The panel, Bondi's face, the crowd, the silence between each line. She delivered the exact moment the tide turned funny. How years of defending people in court had prepared her for that one confrontation better than anything else. Not because she wanted the drama, but because she understood the difference between making a point and making an impact. She stood up, walked over to the window, and opened it a crack. The street noise filtered in: cars, a dog barking, someone yelling about a lost phone. Life kept moving. She liked that her assistant knocked lightly, then opened the door a few inches. "Hey, they're asking if you want to do another round of interviews. CNN, NPR, a couple podcasts." Crockett glanced back. "Tell them I'm good for now. Really, not even." She smiled. "If I say too much, they'll stop listening sometimes. Silence says more." Her assistant nodded and slipped out. Crockett returned to her desk. She pulled out a legal pad and began scribbling ideas for an upcoming community event. No press, just a town hall. The kind of room where people brought real questions, not talking points. She stopped mid-sentence and wrote something new at the top of the page. "Let your truth be so clear. They have to lie to fight you." That's what it had always been about. Truth, not ego, not exposure. Not being the loudest voice, but being the one that left people thinking long after the lights went off. There was power in that. Not performative power, real power. Because people don't forget when they feel seen, and in that room, in that moment, millions saw her not just defend herself, but all the people like her who've been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed before they ever spoke a word. Crockett smiled to herself just a little. She didn't need a victory lap. The point had already been made, but before the story wrapped, there was one more thing she wanted to make sure the next generation understood, and it had everything to do with worth. A week after the panel, Jasmine Crockett walked into a high school auditorium in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It wasn't part of a campaign stop. No news vans, no staffers with clipboards, just a favor to an old professor who taught government and wanted her to speak to his class. The auditorium smelled like pencil shavings and waxed floors. The stage was bare, the mic slightly too short. She adjusted it herself, no teleprompter, no script, just kids, 9th and 10th graders mostly. A few looked sleepy, a few were whispering, but most were locked in phones, clutched in their laps, waiting to see what she'd say. Crockett scanned the crowd, then spoke. "I'm not going to stand up here and tell you I'm special," she said. "I'm going to tell you I was tired." The room went still. Tired of hearing people talk over me. Tired of watching folks rewrite the rules. While pretending it's fair, tired of being told I didn't belong in rooms I'd earned my way into. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be in Congress. I didn't even know what Congress was for a long time. But I knew what being overlooked felt like. I knew what it meant when someone looked at me and assumed I had nothing to offer. A boy in the third row raised his hand. How do you deal with that? Like when people say stuff about you that's not even true. Crockett paused, then answered honestly. You stop waiting for their permission to be excellent, and you show your work every time again and again until the truth outlives the noise that landed. She walked slowly across the stage. They called me unqualified, she said, but I've spent my whole life preparing for the moment someone tried to erase what I've done. Then she got quiet. And if you ever find yourself in that position where someone tries to shrink you, box you in, say you're not enough, you don't owe them rage, you owe them clarity. Her voice softened. Let them see what they tried to ignore. The auditorium was silent. A girl in the back raised her hand. Do you think that's always enough? Like, will people really listen? Crockett smiled, not out of condescension but recognition. Some won't, she said, but the ones who need to hear you, they will, and they'll remember. She took a breath. I didn't win that panel. I didn't go viral to make a name. I just showed up with the facts, with poise, and with the full weight of every person I've ever stood beside in courtrooms, classrooms, and community centers. She looked around at the room, at the folded arms, the bent heads, the thinking faces, and that's why I'm here now, because I want you to know. You don't need a camera crew to be seen. You don't need applause to be right. And you sure don't need a title to make your voice matter. There was a long pause before the clapping started. Not out of obligation, but because something in her words had sunk in. She stepped down from the stage. A few students followed her out to the parking lot, asking more questions. 2 girls asked for a photo. 1 boy didn't say anything, just held out his hand for a quiet handshake, and Jasmine Crockett left, knowing something she didn't even need to say aloud. The moment may have been sparked on a stage in D.C., but its meaning lived in rooms like this, because the real win wasn't the takedown, it was the message: know your worth. Speak your truth, and when they try to silence you, answer with evidence. If this story moved you, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, remember your voice has power. Your truth matters. And sometimes the best clapback isn't loud. It's accurate. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us truth doesn't flinch. Doesn't.